Welcome back to the Arctic Reptile Ranch, and thanks for checking out this second part of my lighting discussion. In part one, we discussed UV and the importance of visible light to our tortoises. In this part, we're going to take a look at those really long waves with super low peaks, the infrared wavelength. This form of energy is where our reptiles get their body heat from, because unlike mammals, like you and I, they can't generate heat on their own. They need to receive it from an outside source. To truly appreciate infrared and the heat that everybody receives from it, we're going to have to look at this in a totally different way. We're going to have to go thermal. You're now looking at me through a forward-looking infrared device, or FLIR for short. This device converts the infrared wavelengths into a viewable representation that we can see. To make this video a little more watchable, I'm going to give you a combination of the two. The infrared side and the visible spectrum. So just like we did in the UV, we're going to explore the Arctic Reptile Ranch and have a look at the lights that I use for heating and a few of the other lights that I went out and purchased that are available at most pet stores. And I'm also going to discuss other sources of heat that I use. I use radiant heat panels for some enclosures. Most of my enclosures have some sort of under the pad or under the tank heating pad, or I'm using a heat wire to keep their hide boxes warm 24/7. I don't keep them too warm to replace a basking spot, just warm enough that it's like a cozy blanket while they're hanging out, hiding from me, or sleeping at nighttime. This warm blanket allows them to maintain a body temperature between the upper 70s and low 80s at nighttime. So let's begin by having another look at Titan's cage. So over here in my heat lamps, I have two different brands. I have a Sylvania halogen light with a tungsten filament, and I have a commercially available in a pet store Zoom Med reptile basking spot lamp. Now you can see that the reptile basking spot lamp, which is 100 watt, isn't really giving off quite the same amount of heat as my Sylvania is. The Sylvania is giving them a nice 100-ish degree hot spot, whereas this one is only heating it up into the high 80s. But taking a look at Titan himself, you can see that his body's pretty warm. He's been doing his own thermal regulating thing, going in and out of the heated zones. Now overall, you can see that while there are hot spots, these lights are providing a pretty wide beam of light instead of a narrow beam of light, so it's decently warm in most of the back of his cage. One claim made by this particular light is that it gives off UV. Let's get my UV meter and see how much UV we're actually getting from this light bulb. This is able to read UV between 280 and 400 nanometers, which covers both UVA and UVB. This claims to give off UVA. Let's see. This is giving off negligible or next to no UVA, or UV for that matter. So if you've purchased one of these lights thinking you've given yourself an all-around UV and heat lamp, unfortunately, science says otherwise. We're going to go ahead and move on to another enclosure at this point. We're going to move on now to Maple's enclosure. Over here, I'm experimenting with a ceramic heat emitter, CHEs they're commonly called. This is a 100 watt unit, which is very similar in wattage to the light bulb right next door and on either side of her. So we're going to see how effective it is. Well, right off the bat, you can see that this is definitely producing a lot of heat. In the hottest areas, it's given her a hot area of 102, 103. It's kind of localized. It has a really hot spot, and then it diminishes really quickly. It's either hot or not pretty quickly. Now if we go next door and we have a look at this enclosure, you can see that yes, there's a hot spot beneath this bulb, but it's because of the wide beam, the warmth is spread out. And this, by the way, is Rigel's cage. He's one of my star tortoises. So you get a much more gradual decrease so that the animal can thermal regulate itself. If he wants to get super warm, he'll go directly below it. If he just wants to warm up a tiny bit, he'll move out to one of these other rings. Over here with this ceramic heating element, you don't get that. Next, we're going to move over to my larger galloping enclosure. And over here in Beagle's cage, Beagle, who is a very thorough 92 degrees across his body. This enclosure is large, so I need to use 3 lights to give him warm zones. So again, using my halogen lights, you can see this is a gigantic warming zone. Yes, it's hotter in some areas, and you can see where there's bumps and it's raised up just about an inch more, adds more heat to the hot zones. Over here, I'm using or experimenting with one of the red lamps. This is a 100-watt bulb, so it's actually 10 more watts than my halogen lights, and it's a red bulb. But you can see directly below it, it's not even close to the amount of heat given off by the other lights. So some might say this is a softer heat. It's definitely giving off some heat, and I mean 96 degrees is nothing to shake a stick at. But for the wattage, it's definitely not as effective as one of these bulbs over here. From here, we're going to have a look at some of the heating that I use to keep their hide boxes warm. So let's go over here and see Kiwi and Mara. So Kiwi is down here. You can see that her body temperature coming out of her hide box is in the 80s. And you can look back there and see that, yeah, it's warm. Her hide box is keeping her at, has an 86 degree warm spot down there. Up here, Mara is sunning herself, and look at that, she has her body temperature right where she wants it. She has a nice glow across her entire body. There's not, because of the broad beam of this, the difference is only a couple degrees across her body. But when we look inside of her box over here that she goes into and sleeps most of the time, we can see that down there, yeah, there's definitely some good 80-degree weather for nighttime slumbering. Some of my enclosures don't use an under-tank heating pad. They use heating wires. Here we are in the male pancake enclosure. And you can see how that back wall has warm spots on it. The warm spots on this end are created by the heating wire. And the heating wire, I have it going zigzagging underneath of the tiles, but I also have it up into this middle layer of rock, and you can see the heat wire right there. And this gives him a pretty good nighttime temperature. You can see in most parts it's in the 80s, and even his body is in the 90s. A very good temperature for him to be at. Back there you can see a pretty intense glow, and that's his heat lamp. So it's heating not just the substrate below it, but it's also heating up this portion of the ceramic tiles and doing the same on the other side. You can see even at a distance, because of the way ceramic tiles transfer heat, this whole area is nice and warm for him, not just the basking spot. The next form of heating we're going to have a look at is a radiant heat panel. I use radiant heat panels in all of my Exoterra cages, and they're also used in my Galapagos enclosures inside of their nighttime boxes. So let's take a closer look and see how some of these work. Here we have Nova, and she's been hiding out in the back. You can see that her body temperature fluctuates from the 90s to the 80s, and even though the heat emitter itself is in the hundreds, where it's actually heating up the rest isn't quite as intense. It's heating up the substrate and the back wall behind it, which is then radiating more into the rest of the enclosure. So even the substrate in here is in the 80s. Now she does have cooler spots she can go to, but this is a great way to make sure that your young tortoises always have adequate heat, and they're going by the 80-80 rule, which is at least 80 degrees and 80% humidity. And that's why you can see that after a year and a half, look at that perfect shell. She is smooth as can be. Part of giving your tortoises an area where they can adequately thermoregulate themselves requires dialing it in so the temperatures are right where you want it. Now, with the lights that I use, I do that by physical distance. If you get too close, it's too hot. If it's too far away, it's not going to give off enough, make a hot enough hotspot. So that's pretty simple. You just need to use something to raise or lower the light bulb. Now, when it comes to the under the tank pads and the heating wires, those are way too hot. You cannot put those into your enclosure by themselves and expect your tortoises to be healthy. What you're going to end up doing is cooking your tortoise slowly from the bottom. So what I do to regulate those, I use these lamp dimmers. You plug this in, then you plug the wire or your under tank pad into this device, and it has a little sliding thing, just like a light, for mood lighting. And what I do, it takes me a couple days to get it just right, but I'll slowly lower these down. I'll set it at the hottest at first, and then I'll slowly lower it down until I have it to where the insides of their boxes or under where they're sleeping at night is in the low 80s. Using these devices has worked out pretty well. Now, for the radiant heat panels, I use a little bit more exacting. I use an actual thermostat, a digital thermostat, and I give it a range. That way it's not always the same hot, and I'm not always drawing power. So for most of the boxes, I have them set from 84 down to 79, I think. So it'll keep the device on, and when it hits 84 degrees, it turns off. It allows it to gradually cool down to 79, and then turns back on and restarts a cycle, which keeps them warm throughout the entire night. As I mentioned, for all of my lights, I exclusively use halogen light bulbs that have a tungsten filament. Now, I've swapped them out just for this video to show everybody how effective some of them are. And, to some extent, each of the other two light bulbs and that ceramic heating element, they were both pretty effective. It just all depends on what you want to do for your animal. But there's a very specific reason why I use this particular type of halogen bulb. And that reason is all about the spectrum of light that it emits. When you look at these, they give off a slight yellowish, not quite orange glow. Well, while that's what we see, the peak wavelength that this gives off is just into the infrared spectrum, and it's the same spectrum of light that's given off by the early morning and late evening sun. So what I found really interesting was about a week or two after installing these lights in all of my open air enclosures, I started seeing circadian behaviors that I'd never seen before. Before, initially I was using the red lamps because I figured that's a great way to give 24-hour heat, and it's red so they can't see it. I was wrong. I learned later about turtle anatomy, and their eyes can not only perceive wavelengths into the UV spectrum, but they can also see into infrared spectrum. So those red lights are soft, warm glow to us, but to these guys, it's just like having a spotlight shown at you for 24 hours a day. It's too bright for your tortoises also. It's not healthy for them. And it definitely doesn't get them to behave naturally. So I moved on from them to the ceramic heat emitters. And I noticed I had a really hard time getting the right temperatures beneath the hot spots or beneath the basking spots like I wanted. And as you can see from my video, it's really hot and then there's nothing beyond that. So they're really not getting good thermal regulation. And when you put them too close, of course, they're really hot and they can burn your animal. They can actually dry out the top layer of shell, kill the membrane beneath the scute, or kill the membrane between the scute and the bone, and that's really bad for your tortoise. So I had to find something else. And in researching, I learned about these particular lights. So I have all of my heat lamps. They're on the exact same timers as my UV lights. So at about 7 in the morning, everything turns on, and about 9 o'clock at night, everything turns off. And because I've switched to these and I'm giving most every enclosure in here a wide range of light spectrums, at nighttime, when the lights go out, they all go to their hide boxes and sleep for the night. Now, on the subject of them scattering off and going into their boxes, let's have a look at what happens early in the morning before the lights come on. We'll see what temperatures their enclosures are and what temperatures their hide boxes are where these guys bed down for the night.
It's just after 6 a.m. and as you can see, all of my Exoterra enclosures are all still pretty universally warm. The outside glass on these is showing in the upper 70s, which is very similar to the indoor temperature. Keep in mind, due to the heat units used, there are probably warmer spots, and the substrate is probably a little bit warmer for these guys. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, these enclosed chambers are for the most part, nurseries. The radiant heat panels give that nice blanket of warmth over the entire enclosure. We'll come down here and look at Andromeda's enclosure. And you see that the substrate is 69 degrees, but when we look at her, that's probably her right there, that hot spot that you can see through the plastic. But the plastic itself is set in the 70s. Now if we come around here and we look inside of her warm box, yep, there she is. In fact, you can see her stripes. You can see that she is about 83 degrees, even though everything else outside is in the low 70s and upper 60s. But how about that? Not only can we see that she's warm, but we can actually see her heat signature through this plastic box. We'll move over and we'll have a look at the box turtle's enclosure. Typically, the male box turtle likes to be dug in right here, where you can see, even after an entire night with the lights off, this substrate has retained enough warmth to be 77 degrees. Now, just like everybody else, they do have a heated box, but they prefer to burrow and dig. Moving up here to the pancake tortoise, to the male pancake tortoise, we can see that the coolest spot on his is the upper 70s, and we're probably going to get some high 80s down here, 88, 87. This one has kind of been a pain to adjust. But what I did learn with my thermal vision is that even though my heat gun was telling me it was in the mid 80s, this actually, before I started, was in the upper 90s, which is much warmer than I want for his nighttime temperature. But you can see Pi himself has a temperature in the upper 80s, when just inches away, it's in the low 70s. So I may continue to adjust his down a tiny bit, but he seems to be doing fine. And if we move over here, the female pancake tortoise, she's right down there, you can kind of see her. And she's modulating within the 80-degree ranges. And you can also note that even though I use a ceramic heater on her, the substrate hasn't retained much more warmth here than it has over here. There's not a significant difference. And of course, Rigel's in his little stump. Rigel's my male Indian star tortoise. And inside of his enclosure, again, low 80s, keeping him nice and comfortable. Moving over here to Harambe's cage, down here in his little hobbit hole that I've made for him. You can see that his temperature in there is upper 70s, and we get closer to get a better reading. You can see, yep, a couple spots in the 80s. And then we can move over here. What we're seeing here, this extra warm spot on top of his enclosure, that's where the radiant heat panel is that keeps him warm at night. So the wood right there is sitting in the 90s, so that's radiating down to him. Everything else is in the 70s and 60s. His water dish is down in the 60s. And if we have a look over here at where the heat lamps are, yeah, it in fact seems like these ones retained a little bit more heat than the red lamp. The red lamp, it's might as well be the same temperature. So a little bit less effective than I thought it would be. And those spots on the carpet, those are my footprints. Alright, and now we'll move over here to see Mara. Mara has stayed out for the night, and you can see that she in herself, something that I've learned, retains a significant amount of heat. Her body temperature is in the upper 70s. Meanwhile, everything around her is still in the low 70s. A couple of warm spots still where the heat lamp has been. But she normally sleeps in her box, and we can see that in there it's maintaining a good temperature in the low 80s. So now moving over here, we can see that Titan is a pretty early riser. And He's been out of his enclosure for a little while, but his body is up in the upper 70s because of the way that we heat the enclosure. Now, I have learned that this heater makes it way too warm in there for him, and it definitely was giving him warm spots on his shell instead of this overall. You can see he's basically the same temperature across his entire body. So what I did is I added a barrier beneath this so that heat can go through, but not quite as much. And it's still keeping it in the upper 70s and low 80s in there. With that barrier there, it's very easy to see that he is solidly the same temperature throughout his entire body, very evenly heated, instead of having a warm spot up top the way he had before. There's really not a lot of variance in his temperature.
In the mornings, a few minutes after they come on and the light is shining into their boxes through the flaps or through the opening, they all come out and they start basking, and once they're warm enough, they start chomping away and munching away at the grass.
To illustrate my point of natural behaviors, Andromeda has warmed herself up to the level that she wants to be warm, and now she's out doing what tortoises do, grazing. That's how they spend their days, sleeping, warming themselves up, and grazing on the available vegetation.
And these products are what seem to work best for me. I like to turn my videos more how I do versus how to, because there's numerous and multiple ways to do things. As long as you're giving your animal the minimum requirements it needs to survive, after that you can just work on upgrading the way I've done so that your animals have a chance to thrive. So there's no set, this is the only way, this is the best way, this is the worst way to do things. If it works and your animals are healthy, then good on you. If you're lacking some of the stuff that I've described, well, maybe over time build up and try to upgrade your enclosures and see what it does for your animals, and see if you see the same things that I've seen watching all of my animals. So I'd like to thank you once again for joining me up here in Alaska at the Arctic Reptile Ranch. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click like, and if you're not already a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you can see all the really neat and interesting updates and learn more about how I do things in Alaska and learn more about my individual reptiles as I continue to add content to my channel. Thanks, have a great day.